You're making a mistake without even realizing it. And the price you're paying isn't obvious yet, but it's already shaping how people treat you, how they respond to you, and how easily they can predict your next move. You think being open makes you trustworthy, that sharing your thoughts makes you likable, that explaining yourself makes people understand you better. But what's actually happening is something far more subtle. Every time you talk a little too much about your plans, your struggles, or even your opinions, you're not just expressing yourself, you're exposing patterns. And once people see your patterns, they don't need to compete with you anymore. They just need to wait, position themselves, and use your own behavior against you. That's the part most people never see. It's not about someone attacking you directly. It's about them quietly adjusting around you while you keep revealing more than you should. You've probably felt it before without naming it. You tell someone your idea, and suddenly they coincidentally move faster than you. You open up about what stresses you out, and later those exact points become pressure points in conversations. You share what you're working toward, and instead of support, you get subtle resistance, doubt, or interference. At first, it feels random, but it's not. It's a pattern. And the most dangerous part isn't that people are doing this. It's that you're making it easy. You're giving away leverage without realizing it. Because deep down, you've been taught that honesty is always the right move, that transparency builds connection, that saying everything on your mind makes you real. But there's a difference between being real and being readable. And once you become readable, you become predictable. And once you're predictable, you become controllable. That's the shift most people miss. They think they're being strong by showing everything. But in reality, they're removing every layer of protection they have. Meanwhile, the people who seem calm, quiet, and a little harder to figure out, they're not lucky. They're intentional. They understand that information is not just communication, it's positioning. And the less unnecessary information they give away, the more control they keep. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. The real issue isn't that you don't know what to say. It's that you feel the need to say something at all. Silence makes you uneasy. Not explaining yourself feels like you're losing ground. And that's exactly where the problem begins. Because the moment you feel pressured to fill the silence is the moment you start giving away more than you should. Daniel didn't learn this overnight. There was a time when he was just like you. Open, expressive, always explaining himself so people would understand his intentions. He believed that clarity built trust. So he talked. He shared his plans before they were ready. He explained his decisions before anyone even questioned them. He thought being transparent gave him an advantage. But slowly, something started to feel off. Conversations would shift in ways he couldn't explain. People would respond not to what he was doing, but to what he had already revealed. It was like they were always one step ahead, not because they were smarter, but because they had more information about him than he had about them. That's when he realized something most people never stop to question. Communication isn't neutral. It's not just about expressing, it's about positioning. And every word you say either strengthens your position or weakens it. But here's the part almost everyone gets wrong. They think the solution is to stop talking completely, to become distant, cold, unreadable in an obvious way. But that's not power, that's avoidance. And people can sense it. Forced silence creates suspicion. It pushes people away in the wrong way. That's not control. That's just another form of losing the game. Real control is much more subtle. It's knowing exactly what to reveal and what to hold back. It's being present in a conversation, but never fully exposed in it. Daniel started experimenting with this. Instead of answering every question directly, he would respond just enough to keep the conversation moving, but not enough to give away his direction. When people asked about his plans, he spoke in general terms. When they pushed for details, he redirected the focus. Not by avoiding, but by choosing what mattered. And something interesting happened. The more selective he became, the more people leaned in. The more curious they got, the less they could predict him, and the more control he quietly gained. Because when people don't fully understand you, they can't fully strategize around you. But when they think they understand you, because you've told them everything, they don't need to guess anymore. They just act accordingly. And this is where most people unknowingly trap themselves. They over-explain because they want to be seen as honest. They overshare because they want to build connection. But in doing so, they remove all ambiguity. And without ambiguity, there is no edge. The moment everything about you becomes clear, you stop being someone others need to figure out and start becoming someone they can manage. And once someone can manage you, the dynamic has already shifted, even if you don't feel it yet. Daniel understood this shift before it became obvious. He didn't change who he was. He changed how much access people had to him. And that small difference changed everything. What Daniel realized next changed everything. But most people never reach this point because they're too focused on what to say, instead of why they feel the need to say it. Because the real problem isn't communication. It's the psychological trigger behind it. Every time you overshare, it's not random. It's driven by something deeper, an unconscious need for validation, certainty, or control. When you explain your plans, you're not just informing others. You're seeking reassurance that you're on the right path. When you reveal your struggles, you're not just opening up. You're hoping someone will confirm that you're justified. And when you talk about your next move, you're not just sharing. You're trying to feel more certain about it by saying it out loud. But here's the hidden cost. The moment you rely on others to validate your direction, you lose ownership of it. Because now, your decisions are no longer internal. They're influenced by how others react. And people pick up on that faster than you think. They can sense hesitation. They can sense when you're seeking approval instead of acting with certainty. And once they feel that, the dynamic shifts instantly. You're no longer someone who leads. You become someone who can be influenced. That's the mechanism most people miss. It's not about the words themselves. It's about the signal behind the words. Confidence doesn't need to explain itself. Clarity doesn't need to be repeated. Direction doesn't need constant discussion. But uncertainty does. And uncertainty leaks through every unnecessary sentence. That's why some people can say very little and still feel powerful in a room, while others talk endlessly and still feel overlooked or controlled. It's not volume. It's positioning. And here's where it gets even more subtle. The more you explain yourself, the more people start building a mental model of you. They categorize you, predict you, anticipate your reactions before they even happen. And once someone can predict your reaction, they can shape their behavior to guide yours. Not in an obvious way, but in small adjustments. A certain tone, a certain question, a certain timing. And without realizing it, you start responding exactly the way they expect. That's how control actually works in real life. Not through force, but through predictability. And the moment you become predictable, you become manageable. Daniel saw this pattern clearly. He noticed that the people who had the most control in any situation weren't the loudest or the most expressive. They were the ones who revealed the least about their internal state. Not because they were hiding, but because they didn't need external validation to stabilize themselves. Their clarity was internal. Their decisions were already made before they spoke. So when they did speak, it wasn't to seek approval, it was to direct the situation. That's the difference. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Because now you start noticing how often people give themselves away, not through what they do, but through what they feel compelled to say. It usually doesn't happen in dramatic ways. There's no obvious moment where someone says, "I'm using you." It happens in small, everyday situations that feel normal until you start paying attention. Think about a typical work setting. Someone asks you what you're currently working on. It sounds casual, harmless even. So you explain everything, your strategy, your timeline, the exact direction you're planning to take. You think you're being collaborative, but a few days later, you notice something strange. That same person starts bringing up ideas that sound familiar. They move faster, present earlier, position themselves in a way that overlaps with what you shared. And suddenly, you're no longer leading, you're catching up. Nothing was stolen directly. No lines were crossed. But the advantage quietly shifted. Or think about social situations. You open up to someone about what's been stressing you lately, maybe pressure from work, uncertainty about your next move, or something personal that's been weighing on you. In the moment, it feels good to say it out loud. It feels like connection. But later, in a disagreement or even a subtle conversation, those same points come back, not aggressively, but strategically. A comment here, a suggestion there, a tone that nudges you in a certain direction. And without realizing it, you start adjusting. You soften your stance. You hesitate. You compromise faster than you normally would. Not because they forced you, but because they now understand exactly where you're vulnerable. And then there's another pattern that's even harder to notice. You tell people your plans too early. A new idea, a goal, something you're excited about. And instead of acting on it quietly, you talk about it. You describe it in detail. You get reactions, some supportive, some doubtful, some neutral. And those reactions start shaping your behavior. If people seem unimpressed, you lose momentum. If they question it, you start second-guessing. If they show interest, you feel pressure to prove something. And slowly, the plan that once felt clear becomes diluted. Not because it wasn't good, but because too many external voices got involved too soon. This is how most people lose control without ever noticing it. Not through one big mistake, but through a series of small exposures. Each conversation feels harmless. Each explanation feels justified. Each moment of sharing feels natural. But when you stack them together, a pattern emerges. You become easier to read, easier to predict, easier to influence. And the people around you, whether consciously or not, start adjusting to that version of you. Daniel started seeing this everywhere once he understood the mechanism. He noticed how often people revealed their intentions before taking action, how quickly they filled silence with unnecessary details, how easily they gave away what mattered to them most. And once you see it, you realize something uncomfortable. Most people aren't losing because they lack ability. They're losing because they're too exposed. They're playing the game with all their cards face up, while everyone else is quietly holding theirs close. Daniel didn't suddenly become silent or distant. That's the part most people misunderstand. He didn't stop communicating. He changed the way he used it. Instead of seeing every conversation as a chance to express himself, he started seeing it as a situation to manage. And that shift alone gave him an advantage most people never develop. He began with something simple. He stopped answering questions the way people expected. When someone asked what he was working on, he no longer gave the full picture. He gave a version that was true, but incomplete. Enough to satisfy curiosity, but not enough to reveal direction. And at first, it felt uncomfortable. There was a strong urge to explain more, to clarify, to make sure he was fully understood. That urge didn't come from logic. It came from habit, from years of believing that being fully transparent was the right thing to do. But he resisted it. And something interesting happened. The less he explained, the more stable he felt. Because his decisions were no longer being influenced in real time by other people's reactions. He had already decided before the conversation even started. That's the first layer most people miss. Control doesn't come from what you say in the moment. It comes from deciding in advance what you're not going to say. And once you have that boundary, everything changes. You stop reacting. You start directing. Daniel also changed how he handled silence. Before, silence felt like pressure, like something needed to be filled quickly. Now he let it sit. He allowed conversations to breathe without rushing to fill every gap. And that created a different kind of dynamic. People started revealing more about themselves, trying to fill the space he left open. They talked longer. They explained more. And without asking directly, Daniel began learning more about them than they knew about him. That's the second layer. Silence isn't empty. It's leverage. The one who speaks less often sees more. But here's where it gets more strategic. Daniel didn't just reduce what he said. He became intentional about what he did say. He noticed that most people speak to release tension, to feel understood, to feel certain. But when you remove that need, your words become sharper, more selective, more controlled. Instead of sharing his plans early, he delayed them. Instead of explaining his reasoning, he simplified it. Instead of reacting emotionally, he responded only when it served a purpose. And over time, something subtle but powerful started to shift. People stopped trying to influence him as easily. They couldn't read his priorities clearly. They couldn't predict his next move. And without that information, they couldn't position themselves around him anymore. But here's the part most people still get wrong. They think this is about hiding everything, about becoming secretive or closed off. It's not. Because if you hide everything, you lose connection. And without connection, you lose influence in a different way. The real skill is knowing the difference between what builds connection and what gives away control. And that line is much thinner than people realize. There are certain things you can say freely, and others that should almost never be revealed early. Daniel learned to separate the two. Not perfectly at first, but enough to change how people interacted with him. And once that shift happens, you start to notice something else. Not everyone reacts the same way. Some people respect your boundaries. Others push harder. And the ones who push the hardest usually reveal more about their intentions than they realize. But understanding that part requires a different level of awareness, and most people aren't even looking for it yet. The reason Daniel's approach works is simple, but most people never slow down enough to see it. Human behavior is always responding to available information. The more people know about your priorities, your emotions, your timing, and your insecurities, the easier it becomes for them to adjust their behavior around you. They don't even have to be manipulative in an obvious way. Most of the time, they're just doing what people naturally do, looking for advantage, reading signals, and reacting to what is easiest to influence. That's why selective communication is powerful. It reduces the amount of usable information you hand to other people. And when usable information goes down, their ability to predict you goes down with it. Once prediction goes down, control becomes harder. That is the real mechanism. Not mystery for the sake of mystery. Not silence as performance. Just a reduction in unnecessary exposure. Think about how quickly people form assumptions. A few details about your stress, your goals, your fears, or your habits, and they already start building a mental map of you. They begin to guess what will motivate you, what will pressure you, what will make you hesitate, and what will make you overreact. And once that map is built, every interaction becomes easier for them. They know when to push, when to flatter, when to question, and when to stay quiet. But when that map stays incomplete, they lose efficiency. They have to guess more. They have to reveal more. And that alone shifts the balance. But here is what most people misunderstand. They think power comes from saying the perfect thing. In reality, power often comes from not making yourself too easy to decode. Because once people can decode you, they stop listening to your words and start managing your patterns. That is why Daniel's method creates such a strong effect. It interrupts pattern access. It prevents other people from getting a clean read on what matters most to him. And in social dynamics, a clean read is often all someone needs to gain the upper hand. There is also a second reason this works, and it is even more important. Selective communication protects your internal clarity. The moment you speak too early about something important, you invite outside reactions into a process that may not be stable yet. Doubt, praise, skepticism, curiosity, pressure. None of these are neutral once they get inside your thinking. They start altering your perception. Even supportive reactions can weaken you if they make you perform too soon. Even harmless questions can create hesitation if you are not fully anchored in your own direction yet. This is why keeping certain things private is not just social strategy. It is psychological protection. It gives your decisions time to solidify before other people's opinions start pressing against them. And when a decision has had time to solidify, you speak differently. You sound calmer. You reveal less. You don't need reassurance. You don't rush to explain. That change is not cosmetic. People feel it immediately. They sense when someone is centered and when someone is still negotiating with themselves. Daniel's restraint works because it changes both sides of the equation. On the outside, it limits how much others can read and use. On the inside, it strengthens his own stability before outside influence has a chance to interfere. But here is the twist most people still miss. The real value is not just in saying less. It is in learning which kinds of information create the biggest loss of leverage when revealed too early. And that distinction is where almost everyone makes the wrong move. At this point, most people think they understand the idea. Say less, reveal less, protect your position. It sounds simple, but this is exactly where they make the next mistake without realizing it. Because they turn it into a rule. Instead of understanding the deeper pattern behind it, they start holding back in obvious ways. They become quieter, more guarded, more controlled on the surface. And for a short time, it works. They feel safer, less exposed. But then something subtle begins to happen. People start reacting differently. Conversations feel more distant. Opportunities don't flow the same way. And slowly, they begin to feel disconnected from the environment around them. That's when most people either go back to oversharing, or they double down and become completely closed off. But here's the part almost no one sees. The goal was never to reveal less. The goal was to reveal differently. Because there's a difference between reducing information and controlling perception. And if you only reduce information, you create a vacuum. And in any vacuum, people will fill in the gaps themselves. They will guess your intentions. They will assume your motives. They will project their own interpretations onto your silence. And those interpretations are often worse than the truth. This is where the real game begins. Because now it's no longer about what you hide, it's about what you allow people to believe. Daniel understood this shift before it became a problem. He didn't just remove information. He replaced it with controlled signals. When he chose not to reveal his full plan, he didn't leave confusion behind. He gave just enough clarity to guide how others perceived him, without exposing what actually mattered. That's the difference between silence and positioning. Silence alone creates uncertainty, but intentional signals create direction, and direction shapes how people interact with you. But here's the twist most people completely miss. The real danger isn't that people know too much about you. It's that they think they understand you completely. Because once someone believes they have you figured out, they stop questioning. They stop observing. They act with confidence based on that assumption. And that's when they become predictable themselves. That's when the dynamic quietly flips. You're no longer the one being read, realizing it. It rarely feels like manipulation when it's happening. That's why most people stay stuck in it for years without ever realizing what's going on. It shows up in conversations that seem completely normal on the surface. For example, imagine you're talking to someone at work, and they casually ask, "So what's your next move with that project?" It sounds harmless, friendly, even. So you start explaining. You walk them through your idea, your approach, your timing. And as you talk, they nod, ask a few follow-up questions, maybe even agree with you. It feels like a good interaction. But then, a few days later, something shifts. They bring up a new idea in a meeting, one that sounds almost identical to what you shared, but slightly adjusted, slightly faster, slightly better positioned. And now, you're not the one leading anymore. You're reacting. And the strange part is, you can't even point to a clear moment where something went wrong. Because technically, nothing did. You gave the information freely. Or take another situation that's even more subtle. You're dealing with someone who often asks you a lot of questions about how you feel, what you think, what you're planning. It feels like interest. Like they care. So you open up. You tell them what's been on your mind, what's been bothering you, what you're unsure about. And in the moment, it creates a sense of connection. But later, when decisions need to be made or boundaries need to be set, something changes. They start framing things in a way that gently steers you. Not aggressively. Not obviously. Just enough to make you reconsider your stance. They bring up your own words, your doubts, your concerns, your past hesitations, and use them to guide your behavior. And without realizing it, you start adjusting. You become more flexible, more agreeable, less certain, and it feels like your decision, but it was shaped long before you made it. That's the part most people never see. Manipulation isn't always force. It's often alignment. Someone aligns your behavior with the version of you that you already revealed. And once they have that version, they don't need to push hard. They just need to apply pressure in the right places. Even in friendships, this pattern shows up. You might have someone who always seems to know exactly how to get you to say yes, to show up, to agree. Even when you initially didn't plan to. They remind you of what you said before, what you value, what kind of person you believe you are. And slowly, you feel pulled toward a decision that matches that image. Not because it's what you truly want in the moment, but because it's consistent with what you've already revealed about yourself. And consistency is powerful. People rely on it. They use it. And if you're not aware of it, it can quietly shape your behavior over and over again. Daniel started noticing these patterns everywhere. Not just in others, but in how often he used to fall into them himself. He realized that the more he revealed about his internal state, the easier it was for others to predict how to move around him. And once someone can predict your response, they don't need to control you directly. They just need to set the situation up so you walk into the outcome on your own. That's why it feels so natural. That's why it's so hard to detect. Because from the outside, it looks like you're choosing freely. But in reality, your choices are being shaped by information you gave away long before the moment even arrived. If you don't change this pattern, the consequences won't show up all at once. That's what makes it dangerous. It builds slowly, quietly, in ways that feel like bad luck, misalignment, or just how things are. You'll start noticing that no matter how much effort you put in, you're always slightly behind. Not because you're less capable, but because you're always reacting to situations that others saw coming before you did. You'll feel like people somehow anticipate your moves, like they're already prepared for what you're about to do. And the truth is, they are. Because you told them. Not directly in one moment, but over time, through patterns, through repeated explanations, through small pieces of information that added up into a complete picture. And once that picture exists, you lose something most people don't even realize they had: strategic surprise. Without it, Every move you make feels expected, predictable, easy to counter. Over time, this doesn't just affect your outcomes. It starts affecting how people perceive your value. You become someone who is easy to read, easy to anticipate, easy to manage. Not in an obvious or disrespectful way, but in subtle shifts. People interrupt you more. They challenge your ideas more quickly. They don't wait to see what you'll do. They assume they already know. And once that assumption sets in, it becomes very hard to break. Because now, you're not just dealing with your actions, you're dealing with a fixed perception of who you are. And perception, once formed, tends to reinforce itself. But the deeper consequence is internal. The more you live in this pattern, the more you start second-guessing yourself. Because your decisions are constantly being influenced, adjusted, and reshaped by external reactions. You lose the ability to move with clarity because you're always factoring in how others might respond. You hesitate more. You explain more. You seek more reassurance. And without realizing it, you become dependent on feedback just to feel certain about your own direction. That's the real loss. Not control over others, but control over yourself. Because once your clarity depends on outside input, you're no longer operating from a stable center. You're reacting to an environment that is already adjusting to you. And this creates a loop. The more you explain, the more people understand you. The more they understand you, the more they influence you. The more they influence you, the more uncertain you become. And the more uncertain you become, the more you feel the need to explain again. Most people stay in this loop for years. They call it collaboration. They call it communication. They call it being open. But underneath it, they're slowly losing leverage in every interaction that matters. And by the time they notice something is off, the pattern is already deeply ingrained. People already expect them to behave a certain way. They already know how to guide conversations, how to apply pressure, how to shape outcomes. And breaking out of that isn't just about saying less. It's about undoing a version of yourself that others have already learned how to handle. And that is much harder than most people think. By the time Daniel understood the full pattern, he realized something most people never articulate clearly. It's not enough to reduce exposure. You need a system for controlling how and when information moves through you. Because if you don't control the flow, the environment will do it for you. That's when he developed a simple but powerful principle. Never reveal information at the moment it feels most natural to reveal it. Because that natural impulse is usually driven by emotion, not strategy. When you feel the urge to explain, to clarify, to share more than necessary, that is exactly when your guard is lowest. And that's when most people give away their leverage without even noticing. So instead of reacting in the moment, Daniel started creating a delay. Not an awkward pause, not avoidance, but a controlled gap between the question and the answer. That gap gave him time to filter, to decide what part of the truth was useful to share and what part needed to stay internal. And that small delay changed how others experienced him. He no longer felt reactive. He felt deliberate. But here's another layer most people overlook. Not all information has equal weight. Some things you can share freely without losing anything. Surface-level opinions, general experiences, things that don't define your direction or your leverage. But there are 3 categories of information that always carry higher risk when revealed too early. First, anything tied to your timing. When people know when you plan to act, they can move before you or position themselves around you. Second, anything tied to your emotional triggers. When people know what pressures you, what stresses you, what makes you hesitate, they gain access to your decision-making process. And third, anything tied to your long-term direction. Once someone understands where you're going, they don't need to stop you directly. They just need to redirect the path slightly. And that's enough to change your outcome over time. Daniel didn't eliminate these topics from his conversations. He learned to control their visibility. Sometimes he would speak about them in abstract terms. Sometimes he would shift the focus to something adjacent. Sometimes he would let others speak first and reveal their position before giving any signal of his own. And that created a new dynamic. He was no longer participating in conversations the same way. He was shaping them. But here's the twist that separates basic awareness from real control. The goal is not to become invisible. It's to become selectively visible. Because if people can't see anything about you, they disengage. But if they can see just enough to feel like they understand you, while the core remains protected, they stay engaged, without gaining real leverage. That balance is what most people never master. They either expose too much or they hide too much. And both lead to loss of control, just in different ways. Daniel stayed in the middle. He allowed access, but never full access. He gave clarity, but never full clarity. And over time, people stopped trying to figure him out completely. They worked with the version of him they could see. And that was exactly the point. Because once you control what others are allowed to understand about you, you don't just protect your position. You define the playing field they're operating in. And that is a level of control most people never realize is even possible. At some point, Daniel stopped thinking about communication as something casual. He stopped seeing conversations as harmless exchanges where nothing was at stake. Because once you see the pattern clearly, you realize something most people never fully grasp. Every interaction is shaping how much control you have, or how much you're giving away. It's not about being paranoid. It's about being aware of what's actually happening beneath the surface. Most people walk into conversations thinking, how do I express myself? But that question is already flawed, because it assumes expression is the goal. Daniel replaced that question with something different. What outcome does this conversation create? And once you start thinking that way, everything shifts. You stop measuring success by how well you explained yourself. You start measuring it by how well you maintained your position. Because in reality, people don't respond to what you mean. They respond to what they can use. And the more usable information you give them, the more influence they have over how situations unfold around you. That's why all the patterns you've seen, oversharing, over-explaining, reacting too quickly, aren't just habits. They're leaks. Small openings where control slowly drains out without you noticing. And when you step back and connect everything, a clearer picture forms. It was never about saying less just to say less. It was about protecting three things at all times: your direction, your timing, and your internal state. Because those three elements define how you move through any situation. Once they are exposed too early, they stop being yours alone. They become part of the environment, something others can observe, interpret, and respond to. And once that happens, you're no longer operating independently. You're operating within a system that already knows how to adjust to you. But when those three elements stay controlled, something very different happens. You move without interference. You decide without pressure. You act without needing to stabilize yourself through other people's reactions. And that creates a kind of presence that doesn't need to prove anything. People feel it, even if they can't explain it. They sense that you're not easily influenced, that you're not reacting in real time, that your decisions aren't being negotiated in the open. And that alone changes how they approach you. But here's the deeper shift that most people miss. This isn't just about dealing with others. It's about how you relate to yourself. Because the moment you stop needing to explain everything, you start relying less on external validation. You become more comfortable holding your own thoughts without immediately releasing them. You develop the ability to let ideas mature before exposing them to outside pressure. And that changes the quality of your thinking. It becomes more stable, more precise, less reactive. Over time, this compounds. You're not just harder to read, you're harder to influence. Not because you resist everything, but because you choose what actually reaches you. And when you reach that point, something interesting happens. Conversations stop feeling like something you need to manage. They become something you can navigate with clarity. You're no longer trying to keep up with how others respond. You're setting the tone before they even realize it. And that's when the dynamic fully shifts. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that draws attention, but in a quiet, consistent advantage that shows up in every interaction, every decision, every situation where control matters. And once you see that clearly, you realize this was never about being silent. It was about deciding what parts of you are allowed to be seen and when. Daniel didn't try to change everything at once. That's another mistake most people make. They turn awareness into overcorrection. They go from saying everything to saying nothing, from being open to being rigid. But real control doesn't come from extremes. It comes from small, deliberate shifts that compound over time. So he started with one simple rule. In any conversation, he would identify one thing he would not reveal. Not everything, just one. It could be his real intention, his exact timing, or how he actually felt about a situation. And that single boundary changed how he showed up. Because now, instead of speaking freely, he was speaking with awareness. He wasn't reacting automatically. He was choosing. And that choice created space. Space to observe, space to think, space to notice what others were doing while he wasn't fully exposed. Then he added another layer. He stopped answering questions immediately, not in a way that felt forced, but just enough to break the automatic response pattern. A brief pause, a slight redirection, sometimes even answering a different part of the question than what was asked. And in that moment, something subtle happened. The conversation slowed down. It shifted. It stopped being about extracting information from him and became something he could navigate instead. Over time, he also trained himself to recognize specific triggers. The moments when he felt the strongest urge to explain more than necessary. When he wanted to justify his decisions, defend his position, or make sure he was fully understood. Those moments weren't random. They were signals, indicators that he was about to give away more than he should. And instead of following that impulse, he learned to sit with it, to let the discomfort pass without reacting to it. That alone gave him more control than any technique. Because now, he wasn't being driven by the need to release tension. He was holding his position, even when it felt unnatural at first. But here's where it becomes more strategic. Daniel didn't just hold back. He replaced what he would normally say with something else. When someone asked for specifics, he gave structure instead of detail. When someone looked for emotion, he gave neutrality instead of reaction. When someone tried to define his direction, he gave flexibility instead of commitment. And this wasn't about being deceptive. It was about controlling what level of access each situation required. Because not every question deserves a complete answer. Not every conversation deserves full transparency. And once you start seeing it that way, your behavior changes naturally. You don't feel the need to protect everything. You just stop giving away what matters most. But here's the part that most people won't fully understand until they experience it themselves. The real shift doesn't happen when you say less. It happens when you start noticing how people respond differently when they can't fully read you. Some will lean in more. Some will test you. Some will try to push harder for clarity. And those reactions, they reveal more than the original question ever did. That's where the next level begins. Because once you start paying attention to those responses, you begin to see patterns in others the same way they used to see patterns in you. And that's a different kind of awareness entirely, one that most people never even realize they're missing. By now, Daniel no longer needed to remind himself to say less. That phase was already behind him. What replaced it was something far more powerful and far more subtle. He started seeing every interaction as a layer of positioning, not in a manipulative way, but in a way that made him aware of what was actually being exchanged beneath the surface. Because once you understand that information is leverage, you stop treating your thoughts, your plans, and your emotions as things to casually release. You start treating them as assets, things that should move only when there's a reason, not just a feeling. And that changes how you experience conversations entirely. You're no longer focused on filling space. You're focused on maintaining alignment. Alignment between what you know, what you reveal, and what others are allowed to conclude about you. And when those three stay aligned, something interesting happens. You don't feel pressure to prove yourself anymore. You don't feel the need to correct every misunderstanding or clarify every detail. Because you realize that not being fully understood is not a weakness. In many situations, it's an advantage. But here's the deeper layer that most people never reach. Once you stop over-revealing, you begin to notice how often other people do it. You start seeing patterns in how they speak, where they hesitate, what they emphasize, what they repeat. You notice the moments when they try to steer the conversation, when they test your reactions, when they push for more information than they actually need. And suddenly, the dynamic flips completely. You're no longer the one being read, you're the one observing. Not in an obvious way, not in a way that changes the tone of the interaction, but in a quiet awareness that gives you options. And having options is where control actually comes from. Because when you're aware of what's happening, you're not forced into a single response. You can choose to engage, to redirect, to delay, or to say just enough to move things forward without exposing what matters. And over time, this becomes natural. Not because you're trying to protect yourself constantly, but because you've learned how to move without unnecessary exposure. And that's the part most people never experience. They think control is about dominating a situation or having the perfect response. But real control is quieter than that. It's the ability to stay centered while others reveal themselves. It's the ability to let conversations unfold without giving away your position too early. It's the ability to decide what people are allowed to know, without them realizing that decision is even being made. And once you operate at that level, something shifts permanently. You stop asking, "What should I say next?" and start asking, "What happens if I say this?" And that one question changes everything. Because now, every word has a purpose. Every silence has weight. Every interaction becomes something you can navigate instead of something you react to. And when you reach that point, you start to realize something most people overlook their entire lives. It's not that others are controlling you more than you think. It's that you've been giving them more control than they ever needed. So the real question becomes, if you stopped giving that away starting today, how many situations in your life would begin to change in ways you never expected?